All right. So hopefully this works. So, who here hates changing their password every 30, 90, whatever days? Awesome. Who has ever had an account compromised necessarily through no fault of your own? LinkedIn, Fitbit, there's plenty. We could all get some. Awesome. And for those of you whose hands weren't up, maybe you're just waiting for the next talk. Hopefully it's still enjoyable for you. So, like Susan said, I'm Ray. I'm a adversarial team lead over at Avalara and Durham. We do taxes and stuff. Also love competing in and running CTFs, a member of Eversec, so be sure to check out the CTF after the talks are done. There'll be 2 flags in the presentation, so stay tuned. Yes, you can take pictures. There'll be an inconspicuous giant orange flag if it's relevant to the CTF, and one of them you won't have to worry about writing down. I think it'll automatically tweet out in like 40 minutes. I enjoy passwords. It's a bit of a hobby of mine, and yeah, hopefully I'm able to make everyone hate passwords even more than they do. Few quick caveats. I'm not an expert in cryptography or passwords. This is a hobby for me. I'm a professional penetration tester, so as far as my job goes, passwords are a means to an end. There's going to be a lot of slides. Hopefully we can get through them all. If not, I'll share them. They'll be on my blog, I'm sure. They'll be cleaned up because this is also finished very close to con time, a little later than I'd like, so there may be some weird mistakes or typos. They'll be fixed before I share them. And it's not going to be too deep of a dive into password cracking. I decided to sort of cover passwords in general, make this a more, like I said, one-on-one talk. I'll follow up with a different talk about cracking itself, building rigs, stuff like that. And like Marshawn Lynch, I'm just here so I don't get fined. So, this was a lot of fun last time. I don't know if anyone is still on Twitter, because even I don't pay attention anymore. But if you want to tweet during the talk, be sure to tag me and KakilakiCon and use the hashtag PasswordAttacks101. If not, no big deal. So, you ever wonder why we're here? So, passwords are terrible. Passwords are hard to remember. Hopefully I can cover how people are going to attack you and your passwords, how you can sort of defend yourself against some of these attacks, and maybe show off a few different tricks or ways to get into accounts that you may not have thought of. So, quick introduction. I'm going to cover sort of the history of passwords and what they are, the different types of password attacks you might see, sort of the psychology behind both creating passwords as well as attacking them as they sort of go hand in hand, what password hashing is and why it matters to all of this, maybe some stories, if there's time for it, from my time or other people's time actually in the field, and how you can defend against these sort of attacks. But seriously, it's the 10th movie in the series. Why is it not called Fast 10 Your Seatbelts? It was right there. So, if you don't know, I hope all of you have used them before, and if not, you should give a talk on how you've never used a password in your life. Passwords are a method of authentication, but at their core, what they are is a means to verify your identity. When you tell Twitter that you are DoylerSec, they say, prove it, and you give them your password. So if you think about them that way, a lot of things are your password for different things. When you apply for a job and they ask for your social, that's proof that you are who you are. Things like that. And if you couldn't guess from your own experience or this talk, passwords suck. And I'll sort of cover why. We use them to secure basically everything online. Sometimes there's non-password ways or multi-factor authentication, but just about any website you log into is going to have some form of password. All they are is a hopefully secret string of characters. So like I said, it's not just, your password 123. Your social can be a password. A PIN is going to be a password. It's just going to be a much shorter, weaker version, things like that. And again, they don't just suck for you as a user. They suck for your security professionals. They suck for the developers making the applications. It's really bad for everyone involved for different reasons. And a lot of times, your password is the only thing standing between an attacker and the money in your bank account or other things that are important to you. So, passwords have kind of been around for a really long time. If you've ever gone to cryptography talks or secret talks, you'll hear talks about how the Romans would have secret messages or secret ways to encode things. Yes, so as a concept, secret messages have been around for a very long time. As far as computers are concerned, in the 60s or 70s, they started becoming more of a standard part of computer security, using them to log in, authenticate, things like that. But since computing power was fairly limited and expensive, actual password attacks were also fairly limited. These were usually just brute force attacks, which I'll cover later, and not really sort of a large concern. Come closer to the 90s and 2000s, password attacks became a lot more prevalent because computing power became a lot cheaper, a lot easier to obtain, things like that. This was also sort of the era of something called rainbow tables, which I'll cover later. These sort of changed the landscape for how people were able to attack passwords, as well as how developers and security people needed to protect against these types of attacks. And as many of you know, today they're a huge part of a lot of security talks, a lot of things in the news, big data breaches, passwords get leaked, things like that. So it's really important both as a user and an organization to not only understand, but sort of protect your users and their passwords. So I realized while I was making these slides, it's very hard to sort of categorize the types of attacks I want to cover. So there'll be some weird sort of jumps, but I basically break out the types of password attacks into 3 categories. I'll cover sort of the non-technical and social types of password attacks, and then the technical attacks I'll break into 2 different versions, which will be online attacks and offline attacks. That'll make a little more sense once we get to them. So, social engineering, I found these really fun, cute infographics from Norton, but at its core, social engineering is a way to trick users or companies or someone into giving you private or secret information, such as their password. This can cover anything from getting on a chat with help desk and asking them for a user's password, or to reset a user's password to a value you know, to calling up the bank and saying you forgot your password and need to change, things like that. This can be attacking the organization like those, or it could be attacking a user itself. So someone sends you an email saying, hey, click this link to reset your password. Turns out that that was a fake link, and they now have your new password. Things like that. So, like I said, phishing is sort of part of social engineering. Phishing is going to be attacking the users themselves more often than not. Generally speaking, attackers aren't going to try and phish an organization to get your password. At that point, they'll just attack the entire organization. But if they're trying to trick you into giving them your password, could be an email, again, same method as social engineering, but these are going to be some of those sort of non-technical or social aspects. Generally speaking, attackers are going to have more success tricking you into giving them your password than they are into sort of getting your password from organizations. That's not to say they can't convince organizations to change your password for them. But there's a key difference into getting your password and changing it, which I'll cover later. Another way is kind of just guessing it. Hopefully none of these are your password. Like I said earlier, though, there is a big orange flag, so might be something interesting on this slide. But as it turns out, if you have a very weak password, someone could just guess it and get into your accounts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, your cat's name, your company name 1, 2, 3, some sort of terrible default password that came with your corporate laptop, things like that. Obviously, attackers aren't going to be able to guess and guess and guess, but if your password is the lowest of the low-hanging fruit, they'll be able to get into your account just by guessing it. So you want to make sure that it doesn't fall under, one of these categories. But like I said earlier, a password is sort of any secret information that you use to verify your identity. So an even weaker version of some of these might be secret questions. So a secret question, if it's used to reset your password or verify your identity, is no different than a password. You could have the strongest, most randomly generated password in the world. If your mother's maiden name can be looked up online and that's your secret answer, that's your password. It doesn't matter how strong the other version is. So again, this is going to be social security numbers, any website that uses your social for verification. It's supposed to be secret, kind of not ideal. PINs, these are 4 to 8 numbers. That makes it a lot easier to guess. Things like that. And I'll cover sort of the protections and things like that, but hopefully this gets you thinking that just because it's not in the password field, it's not the only way for a password. It's not the only way for something to be a password, and you still need to sort of account for all of these concerns against them. Another way is they can just steal the passwords. So if you have a password manager, or if your password manager gets breached, they can get all of your passwords. LastPass was fairly recently breached. I've found passwords.txt on people's computers an uncomfortable number of times during engagements, or just getting into someone's local password database. Just because they're not attacking the website doesn't mean they can't get your passwords. So, as always, there's usually an XKCD for something. So another way is to steal it in a more physical manner. Again, you could have the strongest password in the world. Someone could beat you up and take your password from you. Obviously, this is much harder to protect against, but sort of we'll cover some ways that this can at least be alleviated, but it's just something to think about. If a user knows their password, someone can get the password from that user. So, jumping over to the technical attacks. These are a few of the categories I'll cover. I'll go into each of them more depth, but they're going to be brute force attacks, password spraying, credential stuffing, and a few sort of other ones. So, if you're not familiar, a brute force attack is honestly just what it sounds like. It's going to be someone guessing every single possible combination of characters, hoping that one of them is your password. Now, unless your password is 123456 or 0000, it's unlikely, especially as an online attack, that this is going to work. That said, as a developer or a security professional, it's something you still need to take into account because time and bandwidth is effectively unlimited, and time is the only thing an attacker needs to worry about. So if someone is able to try and log into your account 30 million times, they'll probably eventually get into one of them, especially on your system. That doesn't mean you have to lock people's accounts permanently after 3 tries, but that doesn't mean you should let people try forever. Finding the balance between your users and security is an important part here. But again, as you could guess, this is going to be time and resource intensive, and they're fairly easy to protect against as a user because you just need to have a password that's not something like this, really. And as a security developer professional, you have things like CAPTCHAs, you have rate limiting, you have just locking accounts, things like that. But it is still an attack that will happen from time to time, usually in systems where you're going to see weaker passwords like a PIN system. So if you can brute force a 4-character number, that's a lot easier than a random length, random character password. The next one's going to be password spraying, and this is my personal favorite for actually compromising systems or users. So password spraying, instead of guessing every single possible combination of passwords for one user, this is guessing 1 to 5 passwords that you think are fairly likely against every possible user against a system. So say you're attacking LinkedIn. You know that people's LinkedIn username are going to be, first dot last in their company name, something like that. ray.doyle@linkedin.com, so on. So you have your huge list of usernames, and then you're going to guess 3 passwords. Maybe LinkedIn 1, Spring 2023, and password 1, something like that. And I'll cover why I mentioned that Spring 2023 in a bit. That's a really important password. So this is going to be very similar to a brute force attack, except some of those defenses from earlier, like rate limiting on accounts, or especially that one, aren't going to come into play as much because you're only trying to guess, like I said, a handful of passwords against each account. Now, actual rate limiting against the attacker would help. Things like CAPTCHA is still going to help, but the goal is to be a little more widespread than targeting a single user. And yeah, like I said, these are going to be very effective, especially as an attacker, because someone is going to have a weak password at an organization or a company or, in general. Someone has a weak password, and in theory, you only need one user to move further or just to, get money, whatever it is you're attacking. It's also easy to sort of monitor for these as a security defense professional. If you see someone trying to log into 48 accounts in the same hour, probably a little bit malicious. So, credential stuffing. Much like the Thanksgiving dinner, this is reusing things that no one wanted to try and get into something else. So credential stuffing is utilizing previously compromised or obtained passwords and trying them on different systems. So Fitbit was breached, I don't know, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. I don't remember years anymore. If you used the same username and password on Fitbit that you do on Bank of America, someone has likely tried that attack already. They have taken your same username and password and tried it on a myriad of different websites. So this is the first big attack where I want to point out how dangerous password reuse is. Credential stuffing is the easiest way for an attacker to gain access to an account. They don't have to do any real online attacks. They don't have to do any real offline attacks in theory. All they need is for you to reuse the same password on more than one system. If that happens, and then the more systems you use that password on, the more points of failure that could occur. So if you use your password on 30 different websites, one of them gets compromised, now you've lost 30 different accounts. And then in theory, 30 organizations could be attacked further. These are usually more effective in cases where there's a large corpus of stolen credentials. So LinkedIn's data breach from a while back has been particularly fruitful during engagements. They had a fairly large data breach, combined with the fact that the type of people who use LinkedIn are usually professionals, and they tend to use their professional credentials. So people may have their work username as their LinkedIn login, and unfortunately use the same login at that work. And again, defending against this as a developer or security professional is a little harder. There are tools and services now that can sort of monitor for these credential leaks and say, hey, this password's been leaked before, you can't use it here. But other than that, again, a lot of the monitoring or logging is still going to help if someone's trying to log into 38 different accounts, probably malicious, things like that. As a user, the simple advice is don't use the same password more than once. So offline attacks are going to be attacks against passwords that you don't have to do as it sounds online. You're not going to be sending emails to gmail.com, linkedin.com. You're going to be attacking something on your local system and trying to sort of get a user's password from that. More often than not, these are going to be password hashes, which I'll cover a little more in depth later. But at its core, every type of offline password attack is just password cracking. That's a better name for it. There'll be a bunch of different techniques and tools, but at its core, it's just you're trying to crack password hashes to figure out a user's plain text password. So, demo gods willing, I'll give a quick example of what password cracking looks like. It's not complicated. This is honestly a tool attackers use to get passwords. So, let's remember which way the window is. Oh, we got to exit this mode. All right. So, here we have a couple hashes that, we compromised as an attacker or we found online. So, we're going to use a tool called John the Ripper, which I'll cover a little more later, and again, it's more cracking. But as you see, all we had was this one file, hashes.txt, had some crazy stuff in it. These are hashes. The only command I'm going to run is this tool called John, which is John the Ripper, and then the file example.txt. That's all I'm doing. I'm not doing any math. I'm not downloading anything. All I have is these hashes, and I used the wrong file name, so it doesn't work. So if we actually use it against the file we have called hashes.txt, it will do stuff. And it doesn't look that fancy because it already cracked them, actually. But if we show them, those two lines in that file were the password stealth, which, was it's 7 characters, had a few different capitals, and password 5. So obviously not the most secure passwords, but we were able to just get these from a system, run one command, and get them within a matter of seconds 2 passwords. At its core, that's all password cracking is. There's going to be different tools. It'll run a bit longer. Your company will pay for your AWS bills. But all it is getting these hashes somehow and trying to figure out what the user's original plain text password was. And now my window is gone from this window. So very simple. I'll have a few more interesting demos and cover cracking a bit more in a different talk, but at its core, all offline password attacks are cracking, and all cracking is running a tool against a list of hashes. So the first type of offline attack against these passwords is going to be a brute force attack. And it sounds vaguely familiar if you listened to 3 minutes ago. So again, brute force attack is going to be cost intensive, time intensive, not super effective against most things. That said, since it's offline, a lot of the protections we talked about earlier, like rate limiting captchas, aren't going to help. As a user, if your password is 123456 or 8 A's, that will fall to an attack like this. But other than that, probably not going to be used. It does get costly. I've managed to get a handful of passwords via brute force attacks, and it's usually sort of like, hey, we compromised 80% of the accounts in your company. We're going to try and run a brute force attack for the last 2 days. We got 6 more. You're welcome. Usually not going to be a way attackers get into an account, but it is something to sort of keep in mind. The next one, and this is going to be basically the most common, is going to be a dictionary attack. So this is basically what it sounds like. An attacker has some sort of dictionary that they are going to see if your password is in the list. Now these dictionaries are going to be built on common English words, common leaked passwords, actual lists of leaked passwords, so like I said, that Fitbit, LinkedIn. And I'll cover this a bit more in psychology, but if Steve uses a different password on LinkedIn and Fitbit, but his LinkedIn password is the same as Laura's Fitbit password, an attacker using one of these dictionaries would still be able to compromise his account because people think similarly in theory. People set passwords similarly in theory. So just because you don't reuse the same password doesn't mean someone else didn't reuse your password on a different website, which is why you want your passwords to be not only unique to you, but in theory unique in general. You don't want someone else using your password. And a lot of these attacks, and they'll get touched on a little more in the next few slides, aren't going to be just an outright dictionary. Like we're not going to guess cat, house, bear. You'll guess bear with a 3 instead of an E. Maybe bear, cat, combining 2 words, things like that. So it's not just outright using the English dictionary, unless that's what the system allows for, but it's sort of combining these things into what looks like a password, similar to the way users would. So I mentioned this earlier, and it's a little less relevant nowadays, but rainbow tables were primarily an attack sort of in the early 2000s, which were based on a concept, and this is actually a really cool paper, I read it in high school, which was trading memory for time. So password hashes, especially if they don't have something called assault, which I'll cover later, are always going to be the same. If I put my password into a system and it comes out as a certain hash, and someone else puts in that same password in the same system, especially before we use salts, they'll have the same output. What this means is you can pre-compute all possibilities. So an attacker would use these dictionaries, use these brute force attacks, and guess passwords before they even had your hashes. And then, if they were like me, they had a binder full of DVDs that had these hashes on them. So then, since you've converted sort of your time into memory, you have this large-scale lookup table where you can say, hey, I have this hash. What's the password? And they would just look it up in this large database effectively. Now, this is a lot less effective against most things nowadays because of things like salts. Weirdly enough, the thing it's most effective against is SMS and 3G, 2G. People who know more about phones will know this, but it's actually a way to still sniff old school, like downgraded phone conversations, things like that. Rainbow tables still work on it. You could still download them. As far as I know, that's still the best use of rainbow tables, but there's probably still plenty more. Windows passwords under 8 characters, if somehow LM's turned on, things like that. Some of the other types of attacks, again, if you listened before, this is all just cracking. It's different ways of cracking. Hybrid attack, like I said, it's sort of dictionary and brute force. So instead of doing, bear, cat, it'll do bear 123, bear 234. These are going to be more useful for things like company name, season year, things like that. Combining dictionary and brute force attacks usually isn't that helpful, other than like getting the last few passwords for a company you've compromised, or targeting very specific word combinations. Mask attacks are going to be the real type of attack you use instead of dictionary attacks. These are going to be the things that convert the word bear into bear with an 3 instead of an E, or adds an exclamation mark to the end of every password because the company requires complexity, or puts a 1 at the end of every password because someone required complexity, things like that. Combinator attacks is just something Hashcat calls them. This is combining 2 dictionaries. This is the one where you take bear, you take cat, and you get bearcat. A lot of these are just going to be different names for tools or different names for modes in the tool, but hopefully at this point you understand at their core, this is an attacker taking a possible password, trying to get the hash, and seeing if it matches yours in the end.
So on the dictionary attacks and all that stuff, so there's been talk about a person knows only so many, like a subset of words that we do. And then you go off that versus doing the full dictionary attack. You only do the words, like I think there's like 300,000 words.
Yeah, something like that, because I had to look it up recently for some math. Yeah, so a lot of times, especially if you're going to try and build one of these dictionaries, you'll start, if you want to start with the English language, you'll start with and there's scholars who have figured there's like the 10,000 most common English language words, and then you'll combine that with the 10,000 most common passwords in database leaks, and then you'll combine that with something called Rocky because it works all the time. And you'll sort of combine these to make your sort of personal dictionary. But yeah, in theory, as a user, if you wanted to use dictionary words in your password by themselves, you would want to use the least common ones. Although once you started doing that, attackers would then use the least common ones in their attacks and so on. So it becomes sort of that race. But yeah, especially if you have a system or a method where you want to use dictionary words, using less common words like plosives, which is the noise that I keep making in this microphone, it's going to be a lot less common than the word bear or cat. So these are a few of the most common password cracking tools. Well, 2 out of 3. The third one I included for history's purposes. John the Ripper is the one I showed off a second ago. It's very old school. I honestly don't know how old it is at this point. Open source password cracking tool. It's been improved over time. There's a version that uses GPUs now. It's great. It's simple. It's usually sort of my first go-to, and when I personally use it like I showed that example. I type John, I type the password file, I hope something falls out. If not, then I'll move to the next tool, which is Hashcat. This is going to be a newer tool. It was closed source until 2015. It runs on every operating system. It's optimized for GPUs. It's very fast. It's fairly straightforward to use, especially if you just look up on my blog the flags because you forget them all the time. And it cracks a ton of different hashes. The third one was Cain Enable. This was a Windows password cracking tool that was surprisingly fast, especially for its time, was able to extract some plain text passwords in great ways. I think it's been discontinued completely at this point, especially because Windows password hashes have changed. But if these 2 or 3 tools don't sort of fit your need, there's probably a tool out there. If you just go, MySQL password cracking tool, there's something out there. So speaking of cracking, there's that big orange flag again. And you don't have to worry about writing this down. It'll automatically tweet out. Hopefully it's 7:45. We'll see. But this is a flag you're going to have to actually crack yourselves. So maybe 2 of these tools would be helpful in that. So I kind of lied when I said that there's only 2 or 3 types of password attacks. There actually is one more. But it's not really an attack. You could just download them. So what do I mean? So all of those data breaches and all of those leaks and all of those things I talked about, those passwords are online for you. Someone already hacked into LinkedIn, someone already cracked the passwords for you, and someone uploaded them somewhere. Troy Hunt finally released some of his passwords. Despite many of our years of arguing, he did a good thing. If you ever heard of the Have I Been Pwned website, it's wonderful. You should check it out. I do have internet. I show it off real quick. We're not going to demo it. You literally can go to this website, and you can type in your username. We're not going to do it because we don't need to see where I've been pwned. And it will show you. It's plenty of places. And it will show you any of these data breaches in which your account showed up. So LinkedIn is going to be there for most people in the room. Fitbit's there for a lot of people. Spotify, things like that. But it's a good sort of first check to be like, hey, I need to change my LinkedIn password, and also, crap, I shouldn't have used that password more than one place. But he actually shared most of these passwords with people. Not all of them, I don't think, but... So he has a huge list, 306 million passwords he released. Everyone's favorite buzzword, the dark web. You can buy passwords on the dark web. Or your company can pay a different organization hundreds of thousands of dollars for them to download these files for you. There are companies who all they do is download these password leaks and sell them back to your company for a lot of money. Great business model if you want to get into that. All you have to do is make a database and organize it. There's also a lot of lists on GitHub. There are a few forums where you can sort of download these lists, but they're not all free. It's a little annoying. As you can imagine, users don't want their passwords to be leaked online. Companies don't want them. So it's a little harder. There's not always a central, easy to safe repository to sort of download these, but if you look, you can find them. Usually, as an attacker, you're just going to find some of these lists that people have already gone through. You're not going to need the sort of the database breaches themselves. You're not trying to, steal people's information the second it gets out. Hopefully, don't do that. But yeah, and honestly, I don't know who they thought their audience was when they made this commercial if you've never seen it. The MPAA released, it was a trailer before movies at one point, a video, and it said you wouldn't download a car. I would. I don't know anyone who wouldn't download a car. If it was possible, we would all download a car, so. So, I talked about this before, I've mentioned it a few times, but now that I've sort of covered what the attacks are, I want to cover what a hash is. So, when you log into a website, your password, hopefully, is hashed. And then when an attacker compromises LinkedIn, they're going to hopefully just get your password hash. They won't get, Bearcat123. They'll get something that looked like that Eversec flag, and they'll have to, work to crack it using some of those tools. At its core, these are going to be different algorithms. They're going to be different math. They're going to do something to sort of, A, protect your password a little bit, and B, make sure the company doesn't have your plain text password so they don't have to worry about being liable for it or things like that. So again, at its core, you take password with an exclamation mark, it goes into a magical black box of math, something happens, and then that string on the other end comes out. That's the actual MD5 hash of that string on the left. Those two are the same value. Yeah?
It's your hope that the company
Yes.
salts their hashes.
Yes. So I managed to forget that slide, so we're going to talk about it now. So it was just going to be an image. Anyone is going to talk over it. So like I said earlier, rainbow tables used to be super effective, and they sort of stopped. And hashing, as you see, is this magical black box in which password always comes out to the thing on the other hand. So, and I honestly don't know the history of this, so we'll just say it was Unix and probably Berkeley. They did a lot. So salting a password is when you put something before, after, in the middle, it doesn't matter. You're adding something to a user's password to modify the value. The reason you're doing this is so that when I enter in password and Laura enters in password, they show up as different hashes. A, that doesn't make it obvious to an attacker or a developer that two people have the same password, and B, it makes it much harder as an attacker to attack these passwords because now you have to include all of the potential salts yourself. So rainbow tables are effectively out the window because instead of just generating every possible hash, you now have to generate every possible hash for every possible password, including every possible salt. So the scale of this memory trade-off you had before is enormous. It's still possible, especially if the salt's 2 characters, something like that, but most systems, you're done. You don't care about rainbow tables anymore. It's also going to make those dictionary attacks a little bit harder. Not quite as large scale as the rainbow table attack, but it's going to add an extra layer of difficulty for the attacker. It's going to add an extra layer of protection for the user, and it's just going to make things better. If for some reason you are a developer or an organization and you have unsalted hashes, don't. There's no reason. It's computationally, if you could guess, it's not much more. You're just adding a little more to someone's password. The math and the computer, computation required doesn't change. The magic math blocks, basically the same. The string is just a little bit longer. The extra layer of protection for your users is enormous. This is the reason that everyone isn't walking around with binders of rainbow tables anymore. So, Now that everyone knows a bit more about passwords and securities, it's time for a pop quiz involving my two dogs. So on the left, we have Sushi. Her password for application A was sushibear123. Sake on the right, that's a super complicated password. Now it's a different application. So who here thinks that Sushi had the more secure password? All right, no one. Who here thinks that Sake had the more secure password? Who here knows me well and thinks that this was a trick question? The third group is correct. As it turns out, the developers of Sushi's application were using some sort of algorithm called bcrypt, and they were salting their hashes, and it was just, honestly, pretty hard to crack. Sushi wasn't in the dictionary. Unfortunately, the developer of Sake's application wasn't hashing the passwords at all. Their database was leaked, and the plain text passwords were just in there for everyone to see. So Sake's account actually got compromised before Sushi's, and it was no fault of her own. As a user, she thought she set a much better password than Sushi. So as a user, you need to understand that these password attacks aren't always just going to be on your shoulders, which sucks. If that was your password and you got compromised, you'd be pissed. But as a developer or as a security professional, you also need to be aware of the fact that the onus isn't only on your users. You need to be able to protect them, hash your passwords, salt those hashes, prevent some of those brute force attacks, things like that. So hopefully now we understand what sort of attacks there are, things like that. But I wanted to cover the psychology of both passwords and password attacks to explain how to make these attacks easier as an attacker or harder as a user. So sort of why people use weak passwords, what some of the common password patterns you'll see are going to be, the dangers of password reuse, if I haven't covered that enough already, and how attackers will target humans in general, not just you, the user, but how you can attack humans to get into these systems. So first we'll start with the NIST password guidelines, which is a whole long document. This is a very small part of it. And the only reason it matters is because the security guy at your company, he read this and someone told him he has to do it, especially because he ends up on some sort of security scorecard if he doesn't. It's a lot of words, but it's actually really important to note, especially now, these big fancy NIST guidelines, they don't say anything about complexity. They don't say you have to have exclamation marks or commas or numbers or letters. They don't say anything about any of that. The only thing they say, and it's a little hard to see, is secrets need to be 8 characters in length. That's it. That's all they care about. And I don't want to dive too in depth into this because, like I said, it's a 101. But the reason for this is the longer a password is, the harder it is to attack. It's so much better to add a 8-character English word to the end of your password than it is to add 1 exclamation mark. The reason for this is there's something called entropy. It's a big fancy math thing. But at its core, if someone is attacking your password, the thing you care about, sort of, obviously weak passwords are going to be different, is how many possible combinations there are. So if you have a character that's 10 English letters long, that's going to be 10 possible values for 26 or 52. It's a big number. I had a slide. It gets scary and confusing. If you have a 6-character password that has exclamation marks and capitals and lowercase numbers, that number is actually going to be smaller, even though you think, hey, I got all this cool stuff. So NIST, after many years, realized that length matters more than anything else. As a user, this is great news. You don't have to have all this crazy shit that people make you have because you're going to do bad stuff, which we'll cover. And as a developer, you need to understand that length is important. So you need to stop limiting your users' max length and start increasing their minimum length and stop requiring some of the stupid stuff. Unfortunately, that's not what happens. So here's Microsoft. This is from Microsoft. Their recommendation, at least 12, but 14 is better. So that's length. That's good. Ideally, we'd go down to 8, but, well, they're requiring uppercase and lowercase numbers and symbols. That's annoying. I can't remember that stuff. I don't know a lot of people who can, especially if it's unique. Not a word in a dictionary. All right, well, that's good, but makes it harder for everyone involved. Significantly different from your previous passwords. Now, that's a good one, and we'll sort of touch on why. And easy for you to remember, but difficult for others to guess, like all of these attacks. So, all right, these are okay rules. They're not the best, they're not the worst. Now, this is a great Twitter account that a lot of these examples are going to come from, but it's examples of websites that tried their best but did wrong. So here we have a website in which we have some sort of huge password, and it won't let us use it because we have repetitive characters somewhere in the middle of it. We have a 20-character password, but if we have two twos next to each other, it thinks it's weak. All right? Here's just a nice long thing that's great to read. Even as a developer, I wouldn't want to read this. So, we can't have some special characters. We can't use the 4-1. There's minimum 12. Awesome. As a user, I love this. I'm going to definitely use a strong password. Here's one where we have to use special characters, but, well, we can't use some of them. Awesome. That's a lot of them. Well, I guess I have to put an exclamation mark at the end of my password now because that's the only one I see that's allowed. Great. Too bad every user on the system now has an exclamation mark at the end of the password. Oh, here's another one. Requires a max of 20, so great. We made it worse even according to NIST. At least 6, fine. Great. We are limiting some special characters again. There's no reason for that. And again, it has some vague knowledge about sequences. We don't know how many. It does some sort of checking to make sure we don't have consecutive numbers or repetition. Awesome. As a user, I'm loving having to make passwords for all of these. Oops. Here's another one. No spaces or 3 consecutive characters. The reason for this consecutive characters from a developer standpoint is you don't want passwords like 11111. Unfortunately, this also prevents randomly generated passwords that just have 3 threes in the middle. It's a decent attempt, but you're not helping yourself or your users. This one, again, we got, a different list of special characters. That's even better. So now we have 8 different passwords for 8 different websites, and, well, the first one had an exclamation mark in the end. This one's got an @ symbol at the end, because that's the only one we can use, I think. Maybe a £, but here's another great one, which has, we are allowed 0 numbers. Or sorry, this is another great one. So this one tells you how many you have so far. It counts up. So it has to have 0 minimum digits, which as a user, I understand what that sentence means. It allows, again, some special characters, and it is limiting it's requiring X number of things. So again, same thing. This is a weak password because, I don't know. This is a great one, yeah. If anyone here could guess that password, please teach me about password cracking. This is Southwest. Again, it has special characters in it. And I don't touch on this briefly. So the reason, if you see an application that has an error like this, the reason is, quite frankly, either lazy or bad developers. That's it. The reason is because they're trying to either A, prevent a different type of attack against their system, so they're limiting some of those special characters, or B, and this is the worst one, they're not hashing your password and they don't want weird shit in their database. This is generally speaking, or they're using a mainframe and it's, your bank, and you should be like, hey, we stopped using mainframes 100 years ago. Soldier of Fortran's going to have a talk about it soon. No, we're actually still use mainframes. They have a lot of issues with passwords, but generally speaking, if an application is limiting normal special characters, the Unicode one and the past one, all right, that's a little harder as a developer. But if you're stopping someone from using a comma, it's because you're lazy or doing something bad. That's the only reason that would happen. You're either not hashing or you're not handling other sorts of attacks properly. That's another great one. This is a strong password for Disney+. Come on, guys. This is actually my personal favorite. If you're not familiar, Coalfire is a security consulting organization. This is a company that charges money to do security, and they prevent special characters. Yeah. Well, I was logging in, and they were yelling at me. So, now that we understand sort of how annoying it is for a user, the psychology behind setting a password is you want to be able to remember it. You want to be able to use it. So people, as a user, you want to try and shy away from these. As an attacker, you want to try and use these. They're going to use things they can remember. Pet names, birthdays, nicknames, parents' names. You've heard the list. You could guess the list. These are things that are going to be in every Facebook poll that's like, list your top 3 first pets. Things like that. But, again, these are going to be easy to attack. People are also going to reuse passwords because It's hard to remember 400 passwords. You've got so many different accounts. So even if they don't reuse them, they're going to have, Bearcat LinkedIn, Bearcat Gmail, Bearcat Facebook, things like that. No, it's not a good idea. It's a bad idea. Because then when LinkedIn gets cracked, they'll see that your password is Bearcat LinkedIn, and then they'll try Bearcat Bank of America, and so on. Also, when you require users to have these things, they're going to do stuff, like I said, they're going to put an exclamation mark at the end. They're going to replace all the O's with zeros. Because you know what? That's easy to remember, and it fits your stupid requirements. There are also people at our core, we think we're doing something complex because we capitalize every third letter in our password, and we put an @ symbol at the end instead of an exclamation mark, which to us, we didn't follow that bad advice. We did a little good. That a computer doesn't care. A computer can guess that a little more difficultly than the one where everyone has an exclamation mark at the end. So in theory, if you want to create a strong password, you'll want to use something that isn't quite as obvious and is a little more unique to you. And I'll touch on those briefly, but I don't want to run out of time. So we'll skip this live demo. It would just be running hashcat against another type of password list. Again, password cracking is not that exciting and it's not that difficult. It's running the word hashcat, a few fancy flags you have to look up every time, and then the file you're attacking, and it will spit out users' passwords for you. So how do you defend yourself? Strong passwords, obviously, one of these is a little stronger than the other one. Ideally, your passwords will be random, so it's not going to be Bearcat. It'll be just a random string that you don't necessarily know. It'll be unique, ideally to you, at least to you, but ideally to everyone. You don't want to share your passwords. Don't give your high school girlfriend your password. This is something I talked to someone about recently. You shouldn't be sharing passwords with anyone, ideally. People have written books about, after you die. That's an entirely different topic. Obviously, one day someone will need your passwords, but changing your passwords, sometimes. You don't want to change your password so often that you fall into a terrible pattern, but you don't want to never change it because someone's going to get hacked. Here's an XKCD about, it mentions entropy, and it has all that math and stuff. It's good advice. It's not the best advice. There are reasons for that, but something like correct horse battery staple, in theory, is kind of better than that one that looks better because length is that important. All those little squares, more squares is good. It's not ideal. Dictionary tags will actually crack the bottom one faster now, but if you want to set a password, something like this would be great if you did C0, HO, BA, $T. In your mind, you know your LinkedIn password is like correct horse battery staple, but you've changed it in a way that only you know. Multi-factor authentication, not exactly a password. It's sort of a second factor in addition to your password. Not going to cover it in depth, like I said. A lot of words, but Taylor Swift sort of describes it better. Something you know is a password. This is what we're all familiar with. Something you have is going to be like your little RSA token, your YubiKey, things like that. Something you are could be a different factor. This is going to be like biometric stuff, a fingerprint, a retina scan. Fourth factor, not as common, something you pretend to be happy. Another factor that systems can use is how often, what time you log in, things like that. This is less common, but it's a really great one. If I always start work at 9:30 and I log in at 4 a.m., maybe it's malicious. But again, Swift on security is another great note. Multi-factor, just like everything else I've mentioned, shouldn't increase user friction. If you make your system harder for your users to use, like creating weird password rules or multi-factor, they're going to do bad stuff, or they're not going to use your system. And as a developer, as a company, if users don't use your system, the security is irrelevant. Users have to use your system. They have to want to use your system at least a bit. Here's a fun example of USAA's multi-factor authentication. You log in, user and password. So the first screen is what pops up after you log in. They have text-based multi-factor, whatever, or a PIN. Great. If you hit that button at the bottom, it says, I need more options. It gives you a great option called Use My PIN, which is a 4-digit number. If you have a password and a 4-digit number, that's just 2 passwords, one of which is crappy. That's not multi-factor authentication. Don't do this. Use a password manager if you can. This is the KeePass logo. There's LastPass, OnePass, whatever. This is a way for you, well, That's awkward. But password managers will generate passwords for you. They'll store them for you. You don't have to remember things anymore. It's great. This still counts as a password manager. If you're here or watching this talk and you said, well, my grandson knows about computers and he said not to do this, he doesn't, he's wrong, and he's a liar. The most important thing when it comes to security is knowing your threat model. There's thousands of talks, way longer, way better, but at its core, your 90-year-old grandmother is more likely to be compromised because she used the same password on 38 websites than she is for someone to break into her house, find her password binder, look up her unique password, and use it to log into her bank. Unless your grandma is filthy rich and uses one of these. Then, I don't know, talk to me after the talk. I just like to meet her for no reason. But this is a password manager. This is a perfectly acceptable example if it fits your threat model. Again, running a little late. Don't get phished. Again, don't fall for things. Don't give your password to someone you don't want to. I Googled for data breach, and this was the image that came up, and it's awesome. But if you want to be aware of these data breaches so that you can change your password, a lot of times you'll get an email. LinkedIn will say, hey guys, sorry about that, we got hacked. Change your password. But it also alerts you to think, hey, did I use that password anywhere else? Things like that. So quick story time. One time we were able to break into a company during a penetration test because one of the company employees, who happened to be the security professional, who happened to be the person receiving the report, used their corporate email and the same password on ashleymadison.com that they did at their company. So in our penetration testing report, we had to say that we used the Ashley Madison data breach and the security guy used his same password on both websites. Another one, season year, I glanced over this. The reason psychologically speaking, people use things like spring 2023 is because those of you who raised your hands, your company makes you change your password every 90 days. What also changes every 90 days? The season. So spring 2023 with an exclamation mark. Then summer 2023 with an exclamation mark. Someone in this room has used that password before. I mean, if not, I have, so it still counts. Psychologically, these are going to be passwords. So I was on an engagement, I guessed season year against common first and last names. I didn't even know their employees and managed to get domain administrator with spring 2023 from RDP. Exposed, yep. So, should you put your passwords on the blockchain? No. So, any more questions? We got 3-4 minutes.
Why not blockchain?
There's no reason to put your passwords on the blockchain. Yeah, in the back.
What would you say the best modern approach to assuming passwords will always be breached? Wouldn't we just want to lean right into MFA?
Yes. So, in a perfect world, we wouldn't use passwords, but that's very complicated, and people far smarter than me haven't solved it yet, and it makes it hard for users. The next best step as a person on the other side is some sort of multi-factor authentication. Because like that Taylor Swift meme says, it's not just something you know, it's something you have, it's something you are. These are much harder to guess or, fake. It's harder to copy someone's fingerprint than it is to guess spring 2023. It's harder to steal someone's YubiKey than to guess password 1. If a system you use has multi-factor, turn it on. If you're developing a system, there's no reason not to include it. People will argue text-based MFA is infinitely better than no MFA. It's also better than push MFA, but that's an entirely different topic. There's no reason not to have some sort of multi-factor authentication. There are services that will do it for you. This is going to be the biggest way you can protect your users. Yeah, another question?
What about code book? So you get your favorite book, you go to a certain page number, and you go characters down the page.
Yeah, that's a great one. I know people who did like the first letter of each word in their favorite Bible verse with the numbers at the end, or because that's turning something that's easy to guess, like "and God so loved the world," into AGTSW123. Like, it's turning something easy to guess into something unique and unique to you, which is important. So yeah, if you want to generate your own passwords randomly, grab your favorite book, roll a dice, pick those 6 numbers from a page, and put them in your little password notebook. There are plenty of different ways, but again, ideally, this will be a random number or a random password generated by your password manager or something you use. Yeah, so thanks to Avalara for paying me and letting me come here, things like that. Eversec, the CTF, we're awesome. It's awesome. Go compete. There are 2 flags in this talk. Kakalaki Con, putting on an awesome conference. Been a while since we've been here, and even longer since it was Carolina Con. My dogs and my girlfriend for being involved in the presentation, whether they wanted to or not. And yeah, you guys for coming out. Hopefully you learned a bit. Feel free to share this with your grandma and tell her to buy that password book or do something. Stop using the same password. So yeah, that's all, folks.